Let's take a look at the 2019 macro question number 1, and this is from set number 2. All right, here we go. So assume the economy of Artland is currently operating above full employment. So I'm going to read this through, and then I'm going to go over to a blank graph sheet, because the first 2 parts are draw a graph. I don't want to have enough room to draw it. So we're going to read through this here. Currently operating above full employment, right? So above full employment, that phrase is pretty important. That should jump out to you as an ADAS model question. And we're going to end up drawing an inflationary gap situation, right? We're above the full employment level. So I need parts A, draw the correctly labeled graph, and then make sure you've got all these components, right? Short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, AD, aggregate demand curve, and then show each of the following, right? The equilibrium, output and price level. They give you what they want to label. And then the full employment level, Y sub F. And then part B is going to be the secondary shift, right? So assume the central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. And then on the same graph, we're going to show how the economy would automatically adjust, and that would be sort of the automatic adjustment in the long run, right? And then label the new equilibrium price, and then we'll come back for part 2, and we're going to explain sort of the mechanism for that secondary shift. All right, so I'm going to go over here just to a blank sheet. And again, so this is part A, and then the secondary shift was part B. So we got to draw a inflationary gap situation. So I'm going to draw it nice and big here. So we have price level. And down here we have real GDP. Okay, so we're going to go aggregate demand, short run, aggregate supply. And we said we were going to draw an inflationary gap situation, right? So output, we know, is above the full employment output level. So your long run aggregate supply is going to be somewhere off to the left of this intersection here, right? So long run aggregate supply. So this is going to be our output level with the full employment, so Y sub F. They wanted us to label price level, PL1, and this is your actual output. So in this case, you know, the difference here, right, that's your output gap. You're producing above and beyond your full employment level. All right, so that was part A of this question. And then when you move to part B, they want you to show what's going to happen if the government doesn't intervene to close this gap in the long run. So you should know this short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift back, right? The economy wants to be producing on this full employment level. So in the long run, it sort of gravitates back towards that point. So let's just draw the line where it came all the way back there. So we're going to call this short run aggregate supply 2. We'll call that one 1. So this curve has shifted back to the left. And you see, so your equilibrium points, we're going to sort of gradually move back until we get to that point where it's on the long run aggregate supply. And the other thing we had to label is the new price level. So that would be price level 2. So you can see, obviously, from the graph, we've moved up in price level, right? Hence the name inflationary gap, because to sort of equalize that out, you're going to have upward pressure on the price level. All right, so that was parts A and B. We got to do part 2 of B, but that's more of an explanation as to why this curve shifts back into the left. So there's a couple reasons, different reasons you can explain this. But the main mechanism, the reason that the short run aggregate supply curve is moving back into the left, right, is that input prices are increasing, right? And that makes sense with the price level going up, right? Input prices are increasing. So that could be nominal wages, it could be actual, raw costs. And another reason you could mention is that inflationary expectations are increasing, right? All of those factors, and you didn't need to say all of them. I don't believe you said to kind of explain at least one, but those are mechanisms for which this short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift back into the left, and thereby closing this gap. All right, so let's go back here. All right, so we did part A, part B, and we kind of talked about this explanation, right? So as long as you had some component of those reasons that I just stated, then you should be good on this part 2. And again, that would just be, you know, a short sentence, maybe 2, to work through that explanation. All right, let's go to part C now. Alternatively, suppose the government wants to close the output gap using fiscal policy. Okay, so again, right, we have an inflationary gap. Essentially, the economy is too strong, right? It's too hot. We need to kind of hit the gas, not the gas, hit the brakes a little bit, and slow it down, right, and close that gap. So we actually, it's sort of a counterintuitive scenario where you want to decrease the real GDP output. Okay, so part 1, identify a fiscal policy. Right, so you don't need to know a ton of them here. They just want an example that the government could implement to close the output gap. Okay, so there's a couple of different things you could answer for this one. You could just say, you know, a decrease in government spending. That would reduce real GDP, thereby closing that gap. You could talk about a decrease in transfer payments. You could also talk about an increase in taxes, right? So any one of those would be, you know, they only ask for one example. So those are all examples of fiscal policies, either government spending, transfer payments, and taxes, right? Those are sort of the 3 main big ones that government can do. And make sure you have it in the right direction, right? Because if you just say, you know, if you don't specify, well, government spending has to decrease, then I don't think you would get the point there. All right, part 2, how will the fiscal policy action identified in part C, 1, affect the following? So let's just go, whatever example you use, let's just say we're going to use this one. Government spending is decreasing, and then we want to know, how does that impact these 2 variables over here? Well, so walk through the logic, right? Government spending is going down. Real GDP is decreasing, right? We're coming back towards the full employment level on that ADAS graph we drew just a minute ago. So how is the unemployment rate changing as we're moving back towards that level? Well, the unemployment rate is going to be increasing, right? So remember, we were above full employment. So if we're moving back, right, less people are being employed, therefore unemployment is increasing. So that should be an increase. Now, move to the second part here. What happens to the NRU? Well, the NRU is represented by our output level at that full employment level, right? So the long run aggregate supply curve, which is not changing. So the NRU in this case does not change. That remains the same, not affected by fiscal policy at all. Okay, part 3, in closing the output gap, will the automatic adjustment identified in part B1 produce a higher, a lower, or the same price level compared to the fiscal policy identified in part C1? Okay, so we got to go back. What is B1 is up here. So this is where we were showing the long run shift in the short run aggregate supply curve, right, as it was coming back towards full employment level. So we knew, I don't have the graph up here now, but the price level increased, right? So the automatic adjustment, it comes back, we close that inflationary gap, but at a higher price level is where we sort of end up. Okay, so and actually you're comparing this to parts, the policy in C1. So if you thought about it, right, this is actually not moving the short run aggregate supply curve, right? You're sort of moving the demand curve back, but you still should have the same answer there for that one. Okay, let's go to part D. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market. Show the effect of the fiscal policy action identified in part C1 on the equilibrium real interest rate. So again, we're coming back to what our example here, decrease in government spending, and then we want to know what happens to the loanable funds market based upon that. So I don't know, let's just go over here for this one. Loanable funds market, right? We have real interest rate over here. And this is just your quantity of loanable funds over here. We've got a demand curve and a supply curve. And we want to know what's going on mainly to interest rates, right? So let's call that R1. What's going on based upon the fact. So the government is spending less, right? So they essentially don't need to borrow as much money in the loanable funds market to finance their spending, right? So let's call that a decrease in demand for loanable funds. And if we draw the whole graph, we should have quantity 1, quantity 2, and then come across here. We've got interest rate 2, right? So the demand shifted left in this case, and interest rates decrease. So show the effect identified in part C1 on the equilibrium real interest rate. So if you're showing this on a graph, you just show how it's shifting, right? So R1 is greater than R2, right? We know that the interest rate decreased. Part E, given the interest rate change identifying in part D, will the long run aggregate supply curve shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same in the long run? Okay, so again, this is sort of an economic logic question. We know from what we just did, interest rates are decreasing, right? So what happens when interest rates decrease? Well, you get higher investment. All right, investment is interest rate sensitive. And the other great word to use here is capital formation. So think about this as factories, right? You invest more in factories. That's going to increase your productive capacity for the future. So what we're talking about here is essentially higher economic growth and increasing your potential output. So the question here asks about the long run aggregate supply curve, right? So what does it do? Well, it shifts to the right, shift to the right. And that shift to the right is sort of a graphic representation of economic growth in the long run, because as time goes on, you're able to produce more and more and more. Assuming that you're at full employment, right? That can fluctuate based upon the economy, but your potential output is sort of increasing over time if you are experiencing economic growth.